On this episode of Mind, Body, Beauty, we talk all about the misconceptions around sun exposure and vitamin D with sun worshipper Anastasia Boulais. Hey everyone, welcome to Mind, Body, Beauty, helping you feel happier in your own skin. I'm Crystal, the creator of Ecology Skincare, and today I have with me the super smart Anastasia Boulais from the Ancestral Health Society of New Zealand and Whole Nine South Pacific. Now, Anastasia is a Russian-born, Australian-trained medical doctor who's now living in New Zealand and working in a really busy acute care medical centre. She has a keen interest in evolutionary medicine and is the Vice President of the Ancestral Health Society of New Zealand with a commitment to public health education. Anastasia also loves mountain biking, getting out on foot, exploring New Zealand, and lifting heavy things. Welcome, Anastasia.
Hi, Crystal. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today.
No problem.
So I've invited Anastasia on today to share her research and her thoughts around the misconceptions on sun exposure and vitamin D, because there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that our overuse of sunscreen and our habits of staying out of the sun might actually be doing ourselves more harm than good. So Anastasia, in your opinion, what are some of the misconceptions around sun exposure and skin cancer?
Wow, this is such a huge question, and I think very topical to Australia. Many of us would have been brought up with slip, slop, slap campaigns, and a frequent reiteration of this sun and skin cancer link, to the point that we have probably a generation of young people who have grown up basically lathering themselves with sunscreen from head to toe. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the cancer link, but I think it's fair to say that we need to be careful drawing really firm conclusions one way or another. I mean, science is generally a very imprecise subject, and sometimes what we do is we look for truth and we look for a definite answer, and sometimes science just can't necessarily give it. So we need to be careful how we interpret it. For example, when we talk about the sun and we talk about the causative link between the sun and various skin cancers, we're talking about a risk factor. A risk factor is not a cause. So in science, risk factor is a behavior or a factor which is associated with a particular disease. And you would have heard a phrase, correlation doesn't equal causation. When we talk about the sun and skin cancer, this is something that we need to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got to be careful of not swinging too far one way or the other.
Yeah, number one thing that I would probably start with is we say skin cancer as if this is just this one homogeneous thing, and it actually is not the case. When people say that they're worried about skin cancer, what genuinely they talk about is melanoma. And melanoma, it's a cancer of the skin that has a potential to metastasize, so move to different organs, to spread through the body. It can be quite deadly and can cause, quite a significant morbidity. Whereas when we talk about other two types of cancers, and they're basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma, they are indeed the most common cancer among Australians, but they are quite benign in their pathology. So, this common refrain to say skin cancer is very common and very dangerous is actually missing the big picture there and missing the subtleties.
That's really interesting. I wasn't aware of the subtleties with that. So are all three cancers associated with sun exposure, or is it just melanoma?
They seem to be all associated with it. So the epidemiological research, so when you look at the big picture, you look at the cohorts of population and you follow them through their lifetime, various types and various degrees of sun exposure seem to be linked to all of those cancers. But the devil is really in the detail, and it is the type of exposure and, exactly how, where, how much, and what else is associated with it is the real crux of the matter. So it's really not as simple as saying the sun exposure causes melanoma, for example. I would probably say straight away with the two of the common cancers, the BCC and the SCC, we have very good way to treat them. One of them in particular very rarely metastasizes, and the second one, the SCC, metastasizes sometimes. And generally, if people just keep an eye on their moles, and if they see something growing really quickly in a very alarming rate and looking very strange, they should just go see their doctor, and this will get treated. I think the fear of the sun is really concentrated on melanoma. And it is to a large degree promoted in Australia, and we have all seen this scary images of this black tentacle-like thing on TV ads that sort of burrows through. And have you seen those? They're amazing. It's an amazing commercial or advertising or public health campaign, and it really reinforces that state of fear because it's black. It's unknown. It doesn't look like anything that you can detect. And I would say that melanoma is one of those cancers that we actually know quite a lot about. And we know the exact sun exposure patterns that, well, we come pretty close as you can get close in science to knowing what sun exposures are promoting of melanoma. And there are some sun exposures that are actually protective.
Right. So, that campaign is fairly overarching for, most exposure to the sun. So in terms of what type of sun exposure might be more protective, what is that? How can we expose ourselves to the sun in a really safe way?
So an example of the campaign message that I completely disagree with would be there's no such thing as safe tan. And you probably would have heard that a lot. In fact, scientific evidence shows the opposite to be true. There is safe tan. And when we talk about sun exposure, we need to make very clear different types of exposure. So there is the what we call chronic exposure. So being out in the sun most days a week. It's the kind of exposure that doesn't involve burning, and it's the kind of exposure that gradually builds up your tan, as opposed to the other type of exposure, which is called intermittent exposure. And that normally happens on the weekend for a lot of us because we spend a lot of our times indoors, and you go out on Saturday or Sunday and you get caught outside and you've put your sunscreen everywhere, but you've missed that little bit of your shoulder and you come home with a big red mark. So what seems to be happening with melanoma is that intermittent exposure has a role to play, but in the big scheme of things. And there will be other factors that I'll talk to you about later. But what seems to be happening pretty unequivocally in literature is the slow, chronic, careful exposure is protective. And it is probably one of the reasons why people who work outdoors tend to get less melanoma as opposed to indoor workers. So builders would get less than accountants. And there are probably several factors related to that, and one of them is vitamin D.
Yeah, so if we were to, say, eat our lunch outside each day and get a little bit of sun exposure incrementally each day, which camp would that fall into? Would that fall into this sort of more, chronic exposure that would be less likely to cause us issues?
Yeah. To give probably a little bit of scientific backing to this and a bit of a explanation of how tan works, is we get two types of sunlight that are coming through our atmosphere, and they're the UVA and UVB. And there is a third one, UVC, but hopefully the ozone layer has now completely intact and we're not getting any of that. So UVA is the long wavelength and UVB is the shorter wavelength. As far as the sunlight that you can see goes, about 95% is UVA, because UVB being short, a lot of it gets caught in the atmospheric layers, but we do get some of it. And very simple ways people remember it is UVA is for aging, UVB is for burning. But the way that I would remember it is UVA penetrates deep, UVB doesn't penetrate quite as deep. And UVB is the one that helps your skin, initiates the production of vitamin D, among some other things that it also does. When your skin is exposed mostly to UVA, you get a little bit of redness. In fact, you can get quite a lot of redness if you happen to get your UVA exposure in a sunbed. So sunbeds generally contain more UVA than UVB, even accounting for sort of a 95 to 5% ratio. UVB tends to burn a lot faster, but it builds the tan that lasts a lot longer. So UVA is a short-lived tan, UVB is a long-lived tan. And the reason for that is UVB acts on the cells in your skin that actually produce the color. It acts directly on the melanocytes, and it makes them produce melanin, makes them produce more and more of it. Unfortunately, the way that it does that, it changes some DNA structure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably one of the ways that it can lead to cancer formation. So the way that UVA makes tan is it oxidizes melanin precursors. So in simple terms, it causes them to go rusty and produce the tan that way, which is why the tan doesn't last. But unfortunately, oxidation is not a very good process for our skin either. And oxidation can also damage DNA. So here we have two wavelengths. UVA, it can cause indirect DNA damage through oxidation, and UVB, which causes direct DNA damage through formation of the tan. So the question has always been in the scientific community, which one of these is mostly responsible for cancer formation and things like melanoma? And for a long period of time, we used to think that UVB is the primary culprit, which is why every single sunscreen that you pick up generally has an SPF written on it. And SPF is the measure of how much UVB it blocks.
Right.
For many decades, for at least probably 2 decades of the skin research, nobody was really worried about UVA, thinking that, you know, it doesn't burn, it seems to cause a little bit of collagen breakdown with aging, but other than that, it's not a problem. But now what we're starting to realize is that the majority of the damage to the cells may actually be done by the oxidation pathway by UVA. And for people at home, it would be like, oh my God, what's the difference really? UVA, UVB, what are we all talking about? But the difference is huge because it affects what you do on a daily basis. So think about some of the advice that we have been getting for a long time. For example, going out in the sun in the afternoon rather than at midday exposes you to more UVA.
Right.
Using the sunscreen that has the SPF factor blocks the UVB but exposes you more to UVA. Going to a sunbed exposes you more to UVA. Sitting inside a building next to a glass exposes you more to UVA because UVB gets blocked. UVB is short wavelength, it gets blocked by anything. gets blocked by clothing. UVA penetrates. So what I think has been happening with some of the recommendations that we have been giving, thinking that we're doing the right thing, was we inadvertently skewed the ratio of UVA to UVB, and now we're getting a lot more UVA and a lot less UVB. Now, this has been slowly emerging in dermatology community who are looking at the skin, overall skin health, as well as skin cancer. And you would see that a lot of our newer sunscreens are supposed to be broad spectrum, so they're also supposed to block UVA as well. In actual fact, there's only probably a couple of ingredients in sunscreen that are good at blocking both, and there's zinc oxide and titanium dioxide. So zinc oxide is probably the best one in blocking both if you had to block the sunlight altogether. So it's kind of a fascinating way to see how some of our recommendations, which have been obviously meant, very well, skewed some of the behaviours in a way that probably predisposed us to a more unsafe sun exposure. And one of the problems with sunscreen, the reason why there is very, if you look at the literature, there is a little bit of a link between sunscreen use and skin cancer. And I think the explanation for that is very simple, is when people use a lot of sunscreen throughout their year, that one time when they don't, they get burnt. And that's when basically they decrease the ability of the skin to recover, and they have the combination of that oxidation effects of UVA and that direct DNA damage by UVB.
Gosh, so let me see if I got this right. A lot of the things that we do that we think are really protective for ourselves, like wearing sunscreen and staying out of the sun during the middle of the day, could in fact be predisposing us to more of the UVA, which is, increasing the oxidation in the skin, increasing our aging, and sort of doing that damage that could be causing more, like, increased rates of melanoma, because that's right that our melanoma rates have been going up.
They have been going up in some populations, probably slowly sort of edging up through the 80s and 90s. They seem to have stalled a little bit through the 2000s, at least in some populations. But we're certainly not winning the battle by a long shot, considering that, if you go to the beach or if you just go outside, you see the majority of people are really covered up either by sunblock or hats or long sleeves. Now, this is a huge difference to compare to how people were in the sun sort of 30, 40 years ago. The other interesting part of the story is vitamin D, as you've mentioned before. So UVB is the wavelength that causes the skin to start synthesizing vitamin D. And vitamin D on its own is protective across the range of many cancers, including both skin cancer and melanoma, so non-melanoma skin cancer and melanoma. So in addition to exposing yourself more to UVA, you're also blocking UVB, which it reduces and mitigates some of the damage that's caused by sunlight. So in that sense, vitamin D stories is quite interesting as well. The question that we have at the moment is, would supplementing with vitamin D reduce the risk of melanoma? So a lot of the current skin cancer advice says still cover up, but take vitamin D. And I'm not sure we have the evidence to support that.
Yeah, so in terms of the vitamin D that we produce in the skin from UVB sun exposure, is that more useful to the body than vitamin D supplement?
It's a good question, and I don't really know the answer to that. I think probably yes, and also because one of the things about making vitamin D in the skin is that it sets off actually a cascade of several other reactions that are beneficial to our processing of UV light. I don't think it has really been demonstrated that the pill form is equivalent. And as anything that we introduce in the pill form, we've got to be kind of really careful about some of the unintended consequences of that. And unintended consequences of vitamin D supplementation in large quantities, so people overdosing themselves with, 5,000-10,000 units every day, have been linked with things like kidney stones. So I'd be careful about how much vitamin D you take if you're not known to be deficient.
Right. And I mean, vitamin D is not just about bone health. What are some of the functions, like really necessary functions, that vitamin D helps within the body?
Gosh, listen, I don't think that we have gone a year since 2000s without discovering some of the other vitamin D function in the body. I think the most well-known at the moment is its effect on nervous system and on immunity. And currently we have really, really good data to have a look at vitamin D link with autoimmune disease, specifically at the moment multiple sclerosis. So I think this is definitely a very interesting new area of research. Unfortunately, a lot of these really amazing breakthroughs about the role of vitamin D have not been backed by randomized control studies using vitamin D supplementation. The initial excitement about vitamin D is good for heart health, and vitamin D seems to be good for metabolic health in terms of obesity and diabetes. Vitamin D is good for this and autoimmune disease. When you just purely give people vitamin D supplement, apart from the cases of multiple sclerosis, it doesn't seem to do as well. So I think there's something to be said about getting vitamin D from where you're supposed to be getting it. And this is mostly sunlight and probably some of the foods as well, like oily fish.
And so how does our diet and our lifestyle affect our vitamin D conversion from the sun? Because, there are certain things that we can be eating and other things we can do that can, improve that vitamin D conversion. Is that right?
Diet and lifestyle factors are incredibly important in both your utilization of vitamin D, but also in overall protection against skin cancer and melanoma and basically any other cancer. So the way that I would look at melanoma, for example, is not a sunlight exposure disorder. I would look at it as immune system breakdown disorder, because cancer is basically, that's what it is. We always make, our body always makes some sort of errors in translating DNA. The cancer cells are always produced, from the time that we are children, but the proper role of immune system is to get on top of them and stop the transcription early on and avoid this cell starting to multiply. So basically, going back to your question, some of the dietary factors, for example, that are going to affect vitamin D specifically would be, well, for once, you need to have enough cholesterol floating around in your system, because cholesterol is one of the precursors to vitamin D synthesis in the skin. So, for example, people who take a statin, which is a cholesterol-lowering medication, have lower ability to synthesize vitamin D in their skin. Some of the other things that are going to affect your vitamin D production are things like some of the inflammatory foods that you may be having. For example, if you have some sort of a predisposition to celiac disease, or if you have gluten intolerance, the actual grains are going to interfere with some of the vitamin D productions through their pro-inflammatory effect. In terms of the sun exposure in general, there is actually pretty interesting evidence in terms of what is protective and what is harmful. And you probably won't be surprised, because all the good things that are genuinely good for everything else are actually good for protection of your skin. So things like fruits and vegetables, and it seems to be through the antioxidant effect. So once again, oxidation pathways in the skin from the sun exposure can be dampened down by the antioxidants through the diet. Vitamin C seems to be one of those. The interesting one that I have recently looked at is B3, which is a nicotinamide. It's a B3 vitamin. And it is actually used in dermatology for reduction of precancerous lesions, like SCC, reduction of BCC. And that's specifically those two areas, not the melanoma side of things. So you would say, I'm taking this nicotinamide pill twice a day. Is there any food that it actually exists in naturally? And the answer is yes. So B group of vitamins is what you get from your meat. Fish to a lesser degree, well, you can apparently get it from fortified cereals, although I probably wouldn't recommend it. And yeast. I'm not sure how many people actually would eat yeast. And you probably remember the Vegemite has always been touted as a source of B vitamins. I'll probably stick with meat, probably the most safe way to get the B vitamins. But it is one of the other ways that you can protect yourself. And I think one of the ones that people don't actually know about is sleep. It's not a pill.
I bet some people wish it was.
Yeah, exactly. So sleep is very important in several ways for skin protection against UV radiation. And one of them is melatonin. So melatonin is actually one of our antioxidant systems. So a lot of people think of antioxidants as something that you get from broccoli and blueberries and coffee, chocolate. But we actually have a really good, well-functioning antioxidant system, and it is mediated by melatonin. So if you're one of these people who actually not getting enough sleep, there is a link generally with a lot of cancers, and specifically with some of the cancers related to skin. The other way that sleep is really important is a presence of circadian rhythm, so your light and dark cycle. And I know you spoke to Jamie about this at length, so I won't go too far into it, but part of your circadian clock is a separate antioxidant system. So it is hardwired to light and dark. So even if you said that, oh, hey, I'm going to sleep my 8 hours, and you can entrain your melatonin to be produced at that time, even if you had your sleep length sorted, if this sleep length is not tied to light and dark cycle, what it means is that your skin repair is going to be impaired. So let me give you an example, like a real world example of this weird theoretical stuff. Let's say you want to go out to the beach on Sunday. Here are some of the things that you can do that are going to be really, really bad prior to that beach trip. You can go out on Friday night, stay up late, have alcohol, which is a potent pro-oxidant. You can have all sorts of cheap foods. And for example, if you're intolerant to gluten, you can go and have a large pizza. You can have something that's been fried in a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids, like corn oil or canola oil or soybean oil. You can pick your poison there. And you can get a really bad sleep and become really tired and go out in the sun on Sunday. What probably will happen, you'll probably burn more so than you would otherwise, and you probably won't be able to repair some of the damage. Now, some of the things that can do the opposite are things like, number one, you can have really good sleep. Make sure that you, I can't say avoid shift work, but make sure at least you don't go out for a whole day without some sort of a sun protection after shift work. You can actually do things like have your coffee and have your dark chocolate, and we're talking 85-90% dark chocolate. You can have your tomato sauce with olive oil. I'm not sure how protective that's going to be, but probably going to contribute to the overall antioxidants that you'll be getting. You can go out at the time that is more appropriate for us, which is going to be morning and around midday. And if you know that you're going to be in the sun for quite a while, you can cover up with clothing, and maybe have a 10-20 minute gradual exposure depending on your skin type. And that's probably the way that I would do it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that both the exposure that you're getting and some of the other lifestyle factors that you have surrounding it are going to make a huge difference in how your body perceives that sun damage. So when people say the sun causes skin cancer, it's a little bit like asking, does food cause heart disease? What are we talking about here? What food, at what quantities, where, under what circumstances? So you need to look at the big picture.
Yeah, and it sounds like there are so many factors that contribute to whether or not our skin is going to be damaged by the sun, and whether that damage is going to be long-term, whether it's going to affect DNA, whether it's going to increase oxidation in the body and increase inflammation. So it's great that we're sort of building that whole picture around sun exposure and not just looking at it from top line, the sun itself. So Anastasia, in terms of what else we can do for safe sun exposure, we've talked about getting out in the morning, midday sun, covering up, so maybe 10-20 minutes depending on where we are, latitude and our skin type. In terms of sunscreens, looking for sunscreens that contain zinc oxide and titanium.
Listen, I probably would. I'm not sure how I feel about titanium at this point. I've been doing a little bit of research and my own research, and I probably wouldn't recommend it right at this moment. I probably need to read a little bit more into it. I think that zinc is probably the safest one around and has the best track record, so I'll probably stick with that. And if you don't like the white, really cakey kind of zinc, there is invisible zinc on the market, which is pretty good.
Well, yeah, I mean, and certainly a lot of that stuff will really reduce the risks, as well as making sure that we're eating well and getting lots of sleep.
That's right. And if people kind of looked at their sun exposure as make it a yearly project, and you're going to say that, listen, summer is when I produce my vitamin D. Winter is when I do not produce any vitamin D. And this is true generally for most of Australian states, Victoria and New South Wales. Queensland, you'll probably be producing a little bit of vitamin D if you had to go out right in the middle, in July, in the middle of the day, you probably get a little bit. But overall, vitamin D production is practically non-existent in winter. So if you will map out your year to say that, listen, I want to maximize my vitamin D exposure in summer so I can take good vitamin D stores through winter, which incidentally is going to protect you from influenza. So very important to have good vitamin D stores coming in. We are not really meant to have the same vitamin D levels in the blood all year round. Okay, so what I would do starting this spring is start to go out in the sun, and bearing in mind that people's skin types are really different, and yourself and myself, we're going to be a little bit careful with the kind of exposure that we're getting straight up. So introduce gradual exposure, starting with arms and face if you feel comfortable doing that. Probably early in spring, sort of September, October time, and then slowly start increasing that exposure both by time and body parts. So we do know that melanomas are most commonly located on the upper legs on women and backs and abdomen on men. So bearing that in mind, probably would not go from wearing a long skirt to going straight to the beach and just lying on the beach for a long time. You need that protective tan to build up over time, and over time may mean 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. Thank you so much, Anastasia.
Oh, that's all right.
You're going to be talking at the Ancestral Health Symposium event coming up in Queenstown.
Yes, we're really, really excited. It's basically an event that's going to bring such a huge variety of topics together, and probably because we kind of feel like the diet has been covered pretty well in this community, and we really need something more. There's more to life than eating, and for example, talking about skin exposure, it is important, but also things like sleep and some of the other areas that are going to impact on people's health and well-being. So we're very excited about it. I'm going to be talking about a very broad subject of looking at numbers as determinants of health. So looking at people's perception of what their health is, and very often nowadays we see our health as a collection of numbers. For example, our weight, and really, really closed in thinking that weight is our only marker for how well we are. Also things like blood pressure and cholesterol numbers. I feel that even in this community, there is a huge, obsession with what the numbers show. So when people come to me and say, "Oh, I want to do a blood test to find out what my cholesterol levels are," and they're already eating very well, they're looking after themselves, they're sleeping well, I genuinely tell them, why would you do that? If the number is bad, you're going to keep doing what you're doing, and if the number is good, you're going to keep doing what you're doing. So generally, you need to be careful how you look at numbers and whether they tell the full story about somebody's well-being. So that's the subject that I'm going to try to cover in Queenstown.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. Awesome. And we'll pop the links in the show notes as well for the symposium so that people can come and find you guys. It'll be in late October. Anastasia, sorry.
Yeah, and we're going to see you there. I was going to say that's going to be really exciting to see you in person. Yeah.
So Anastasia, where can we find you online?
Listen, I have too many online identities nowadays. So I'm on Twitter, and that's normally sort of short and sharp, and it's probably the best way to get hold of me directly. And I'm at Primal Med Ed, one word, on Twitter. I also write slightly longer rounds on mine and Jamie's blog called evolutionary.com. We also manage the Ancestral Health Society social media on Instagram, AHSNZ, at AHSNZ. On Twitter, I have no idea what it is on Twitter, A Health Soc NZ. Facebook, I don't do personal Facebook, but we do it for the society, and we also have a blog, ancestralhealthnz.org.
Awesome. And we're going to
too many.
That is a lot. We'll pop them all in the show notes for people so they can track you back and take a look at what you've been talking about and musing about, ranting about, all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
So Anastasia, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and your expertise. I'm sure that a lot of people will take a lot out of today's episode in terms of how they can manage their sun exposure a little more safely. And yeah, thank you to everybody for joining us today for Mind Body Beauty. If you like this episode, please subscribe so you can have future episodes coming straight to you. And come and find us on social media. Please like, share, comment on these episodes, and tell us what you've been doing lately to ensure that you get your safe sun exposure throughout the spring, summertime and winter. Thanks for listening. See ya.